This video is brought to you by Squarespace.
For the last week, I've been using the Fujifilm X100VI, and I have very much been enjoying the JPEGs from it. So in this video, I thought I'd share with you the camera settings I've used, as well as the custom film simulation recipe that I've created to get some pretty aesthetically pleasing JPEGs. Let's jump right into the film simulation recipe settings on screen right now. All of this is also in the description for you to take a look. Of course, with the Reala simulation being the newest edition, I've worked the whole look around that first. Before we dive into the settings and I share with you the reasons for how I set the camera up, let's go and do some street photography because last Sunday it was actually St. Patrick's Parade in London. So here's what I managed to shoot.
Beautiful, thanks man. Before we carry on with this video, I'd like to share with you today's sponsor, Squarespace. I have been using Squarespace long before they became sponsors of this channel, and if you're a photographer who wants to look more professional and take your business to a new level, I cannot recommend them enough. For example, I created a page for my St. Patrick's Day photography from last year. This page took me a matter of minutes to create, and I'll also be doing the same with this year's photographs that you've seen in this video. If you're also interested in a few different JPEG recipes I have created over the years, all of that is available as a blog as well, which, as you guessed it, was very straightforward to create on my website. I'll leave a link to all that in the description so you can check it out. So why not at least start your free trial and see what you think. After that, when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Mike Chudley to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now let's get back to the video.
Let's now jump into the camera settings in a little bit more detail and share with you the reasons to why I have the camera set up like this. Talking about the obvious one here, the Reala Ace simulation, I do think this looks fantastic, and of course with it being the newest edition, I wanted to base the whole look around this. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure you will in the comments, but I'm pretty sure that film simulation is coming to a load of older Fujifilm cameras as well. Maybe not all of them, but certainly the most recent of Fujifilm cameras over the last few years, they will also be getting the Reala A simulation. So this film simulation recipe that I've created for this video, the JPEGs you're seeing, you might be able to replicate this entire look on other cameras as well. So check that for yourself depending on what Fujifilm camera you're using. The dynamic range is set at 200. I wanted to keep this one in the middle of the park because if the dynamic range is 400, for example, I don't want it to look too HDR-ish. I don't want all the details in the highlights and all the details in the shadows. Sometimes when an image is too clear, it looks a bit clinical and loses character. However, if there's no dynamic range at all, then you either expose for the highlights or expose for the shadows, and it's just too much contrast and not much of anything. So you've got to find a balance with this. Obviously, do as you wish depending on what look you want. I do want a little bit of contrast, but I also don't want to lose all of the details in the highlights and the shadows. So I think trying to balance it out with dynamic range of 200 seems pretty good. I have set the grain to weak and small. I've said this in previous JPEG videos, but I like the grain effect, but I don't want it to be distracting or the main feature of the image. If you look at one of the JPEGs and it is obviously full of grain, then I think that's too much. But if it does add to the overall character and the details within the image, then I think it can look quite good. Moving on to the S-curve now, I've decided to go for a +1 in both the highlights and the shadows and lean into the contrast a little bit more for this look. Compared to the S-curve, or the tone curve, should I say, on Lightroom when you're editing in post, the tone curve in camera is extremely sensitive, I find. So going any more than +1 in either the highlights or the shadows really throws off the contrast in my opinion. So very subtle adjustments, +1 in both the highlights and the shadows. Onto the white balance, I've decided to go for a 5900 Kelvin rating, which is a pretty standard daylight look, but moving towards the warmer tones, and then a +2 in the red and a -3 in the blue tint. If 5900 seems a little bit too warm for you, then feel free to change this for an auto white balance. Especially if you're shooting inside, sometimes 5900 might look a little bit too warm. The color has been set to +2. There's no complicated reason for this other than I like a little bit of color. And the sharpness is set to 0. I don't think this needs any complicated reasoning either. If an image is too sharp, then you're at the danger of it being a bit too clinical and it not having any character. Not that I don't want to overuse that word character, but you know, that sometimes makes an image, the imperfections of an image sometimes make it more appealing to look at. This is probably a conversation for a whole nother video, but essentially that's also why film looks so good. It's because it isn't too sharp and too perfect. It has its own characteristics. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. The sharpness is set to 0. Let's talk about clarity for a second here, and I thought this issue would be fixed. And the issue I'm talking about is if you adjust the clarity in any way, then there is a processing speed once you press the shutter button. And for things like street photography, where you might take a few frames in a few seconds, this is a no-go for me, so I don't adjust the clarity. Even though I do think -4 on the clarity or -2 in the clarity does look quite nice. And I thought they would fix this because coming off the back of the Fujifilm X100V, the most talked about and hyped about camera of the last 2 or 3 years, that was a bit of an issue and annoyed people. And I thought when I opened this Fujifilm X100VI, turned the camera on, it was the first setting I checked. I went straight to clarity, took a photo and realized there was still this processing issue. So a little bit disappointing about that. So clarity for me and these JPEGs and this whole recipe is set to 0. When I've been using the X100VI and in fact the X100V, actually any camera that I decide to do street photography with, I am mostly shooting in aperture priority. So that's auto ISO, auto shutter speed, and then I will adjust the aperture depending on the photograph I want to take. That's auto ISO up to 6400, and then a minimum shutter speed of 500th of a second. Combined that with a metering mode, for this JPEG look, I think that the center weighted metering does a pretty good job. On my Leica M11 and the Q2 that I used last year, I always had highlight weighted, but I think, well, the X100VI doesn't have highlight weighted metering, so that's not even an option. But the reason to go with highlight weighted metering and other cameras would be to save the highlights and then you adjust the exposure in post with the flexibility of the raw files. We're not using raw files here, but I will just say that the center weighted metering on the X100VI seems to know exactly what it's doing, and I had no complaints in exposure, so I could pretty much use the X100VI in aperture priority the entire time, and I was completely satisfied with the way the camera was exposing things. Combine that with the exposure compensation. Now, I adjusted this depending on the situation. Sometimes things were darker than it appeared on screen, or they were lighter in real life than, you kind of get what I'm saying? So the exposure compensation as a little dial is a really nice little touch to just bump up a third or minus a third of a stop if you need to adjust, if you don't agree with what the camera's exposure is doing. I just said that all really badly. Basically, the metering mode is center weighted. It does a pretty good job, but also adjust the exposure compensation accordingly if you want to make some subtle changes, is what I'm trying to say. I hope you enjoyed these settings, and I hope you enjoy the way this looks for your JPEGs. If you do use this recipe, please tag me on Instagram and share your photos with me. I'd be interested to see what kind of photos you're getting, whether it's with the new X100VI or with any other Fujifilm camera. So I'd love to see what you guys are making. And if you want to hear more from me, then please sign up to the Focal Point newsletter. This is a weekly newsletter, a little bit more personal, maybe a little bit more behind the scenes into my life as a photographer and a YouTuber, and just sharing stuff that maybe doesn't warrant a full YouTube video, but I've got some insights or experience on some stuff that's happened recently. As you can see, it's just a brain dump of thoughts. So sign up to the Focal Point if you would like a weekly email from me. And if you don't want to sign up to that, then feel free not to do that, and just hit subscribe, leave a like, and comment down below. I really do appreciate everyone that's watching these videos week in, week out. So I'm grateful for you all. Thank you for watching, and happy shooting. Photography, not a different kind of shoot. Anyway, I'll stop talking. Peace.